coming to another historical fiction coming soon. I would like to introduce you to Beth Powning, the author of The Sister's Tale, which we're going to talk about today. Thank you very much, Beth, for coming to see us today.
It's my pleasure.
I'm going to read you Beth's little bio and then a little bit about The Sister's Tale, which was a beautiful book. I loved it. It had a lot of things in it that I did know, for example, the British home children, and a lot that I did not know about. And it was the perfect kind of historical fiction for me. It taught me a lot, but I was so engaged with the characters, and her writing was very, very lyrical. So you're in for a treat when she reads to us later. So first of all, Beth's bio. Beth Powning lives in New Brunswick, Canada. Her previous best-selling novel, A Measure of Light, was called The Globe and Mail. The Globe and Mail called it shatteringly exquisite, extraordinary, visceral, and intense, which I would agree with. She is the author of 3 novels and 3 books of literary nonfiction. She's taken photography for 3 books and also writes articles, essays, and blog posts. A full-time writer, she teaches workshops, visits schools, sings in 2 choruses, serves on boards and committees, gardens, photographs, and has chickens and ponies. And if you know me, you know I love chickens. So I am envious of you right now. Now I will read the little synopsis for The Sister's Tale. I heard that this was a sequel to The Sea Captain's Wife, but I had not read The Sea Captain's Wife, and I can tell you now that you don't have to read them in order, but I'm going to go back and buy that book because I really, really enjoyed this one. So this is The Sister's Tale. That one's The Sea Captain's Wife. So now the synopsis for The Sister's Tale: a novel of orphans and widows, terror and hope, and the relationships that hold us together when things fall apart. With murder dominating the news, the respected wife of a New Brunswick sea captain is drawn into the case of a British home child whose bad luck has turned worse. Mortified that she must purchase the girl in a pauper auction to save her from the lechery of wealthy townsmen, Josephine Galloway finds herself suddenly the proprietor of a boarding house, kept afloat by the sweat and tears of a curious and not completely compatible collection of women, including this English teenager, Flora Salford. Flora's place in her new family cannot be complete until she rescues the missing person in her life, the only one who understands the trials she has come through and fresh horrors met since they were separated years before. Reconnecting with characters of Beth Powning's beloved The Sea Captain's Wife, The Sister's Tale is a story of women finding their way together through terrible circumstances they could neither predict nor avoid, but will stop at nothing to overcome. And as I said, Beth's writing is very, very lyrical, very poetic. So I want you to sit back with your coffee or tea and whatever you need and close your eyes, because this is going to be a beautiful, poetic journey for you. So sit back and relax. Beth, thank you very much for reading to us. Are you going to read the first chapter, the opening chapter?
Yes, I'm going to read the entire opening chapter.
Perfect. All right.
Shall I?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm going to disappear here.
Okay.
It's all up to you.
Okay. Chapter 1, Mouse Traps Duly Set. In Josephine's parlor, Mr. Fairweather sat close to the Franklin stove, hands open to its heat. His eyes were like a dog's, trusting and earnest, and Josephine wondered at his distress. She enjoyed the rare occasions when they were alone together, remembering how, when they were school children, he had once slipped her a misspelled note, folded to the size of a pansy. "Dear, will you marry me?" "I apologize for this intrusion, Mrs. Galloway," he said. "It is because of the urgency of the matter. A young girl." He sat back from the fire, turned to her. "But first, tell me what you hear from your husband." "I have only my last letter from him when he was provisioning the ship in New York. Now, of course, he is at sea, so I won't hear from him for some time." She closed her eyes briefly, rejecting even the possibility of sympathy. Her fingers stroked the nap of her cuffs like petting a cat. "It is the way for a sea captain's wife." Her voice was steady, held riches. "I am accustomed to it. But please tell me, what young girl?" As you know, my duties are extensive. We have no almshouse in Pleasant Valley. A year ago, when Harland Fairweather was appointed overseer of the poor by the justices of the peace, his wife, Permelia, had whispered the news to Josephine as they were leaving church. He does not want to do it. She smelled of the new wintergreen tooth cleaner from McLean's drugstore. He will have to pay a substantial fine if he refuses. I told him he must take the position. Harland and Permelia lived with 4 daughters in a mansard-roofed brick house next to Fairweather's Gentleman's Clothing at the lower end of Josephine's Street, where Creek Road met Main Street. Josephine often witnessed Harland in the office at the back of his store, stern and remote like a display behind glass. All the men in her own family were business owners. Her husband's father owned the town's largest dry goods store. Her own father, now in partnership with his 2 sons, owned a boot and shoe factory. I have seen the discussions about the almshouse in the paper, Josephine said. I concur with the opinion that the poor should have such a place, well staffed and provisioned by the province. He paused, surprised, and she surmised that Permelia did not read the brand new Weekly Record. Or perhaps, careful with her grammar, her manners, the people with whom she associated, she perused only the social notes. Growing up, Permelia had been, if not poor, at least disadvantaged. Her widowed mother had worked at the steam laundry. There is much discussion indeed, he agreed. Relief she saw that he could discuss this with her, and a hint of yearning quickly hidden by a return of his eyes and hands to the stove's heat. Based upon the exigencies of taxation rather than compassion. She brushed her hands down her skirts, looking at the tips of her shoes. His care for her held no threat or urgency, only made her feel the poignancy of such a friendship. At the end of the room was an outflung octagonal turret where the Christmas tree stood, filling the parlor with the aromas of moss and sap. Last night, Josephine and her daughters had decorated the tree with popcorn chains, gilded walnut shells, and stars made of paper lace. I have read about the auction, Mr. Fairweather. Once a year, paupers are offered for sale. The bidding went downward rather than up. The lowest bidder won the pauper. It saves the province money. Precisely. There is a girl up for auction. I have visited her. Her name is Flora Salford. He folded his hands in his lap and watched the fire. She saw his lips tighten, pained. Why? Why is she up for auction? Evidently she was brought from England by one of the philanthropic people or organizations. She mentions a lady whose name she may never have known. She, Flora, has been here in Canada for 5 years and has somehow fallen through the cracks, as it were. I suspect that Maria Rye is the philanthropist responsible. Have you heard of her? Yes. Josephine had seen pictures of Maria Rye in the newspaper. She was an Englishwoman. The children she brought to Canada were known as Miss Rye's girls. She's a bit slipshod in tracking the children, especially those not taken to her distributing home in Niagara-on-the-Lake, but dropped in Halifax or St. John. A log crumbled. He prodded the fire into shape with the poker. The short of Flora's story is she went to a farmer and his wife who were both killed in a carriage accident. I heard of that accident on the Mine Hill. Terrible. The girl has no one, and so has ended up on the pauper rolls. Hence, she's to be sold at auction. She has no one? No friends of the couple who could take her in? No, I tried. Harlan broke off, leaning forward to peer out a patch of window where the frost ferns were dissolving. I begged him not to go out this morning. It is 20 degrees below, I told him. Harlan kept a weather station. Every morning, he raised a flag on the roof of his house so he could see the least twitch of breeze. It is 1 1/2 degree colder on this morning than it has been on any December 23rd for 9 years. Josephine craned to see out the window, touched by his concern. Snow rose as from the bristles of an invisible broom, drifted iridescent in the morning sun. Beyond the expanse of snow-covered lawn, she could see Harlan's elderly father walking down the street, terrier at his heels, the tassels of a paisley shawl flirting with the tops of his boots. The dog scurried, eyes squinted against the cold, reluctant, obedient. There's a reason we call my father the Commodore, you know. He will brook no interruption in his routine, safe for death, as he says. He watched a moment longer. Oh, well, Harlan sat back. No, as far as I can tell, Flora is utterly alone. I managed to find a family to take the girl through Christmas. They will have her until the auction. Josephine brought to mind the customary image of a home child. Street Arabs, they were called, assumed to be rough, ill-bred, untrustworthy. Why have you come to me, Mr. Fairweather? Well, unfortunately, Mrs. Galloway, I cannot offer her to you as a servant. By dint of poverty, like any pauper, she has been made a ward of the province. I must beg you to come to the auction. She drew back. I have never. He raised a hand. I understand. I beg you, nonetheless, to come to that rabble of hard-faced men, and I will hear your bid, no matter how softly you may give it, and I will make sure that my gavel comes down for you. I fear for that child. She is... He played a few imaginary piano keys with 2 fingers, looking at the ceiling. A leaf dropped from an aspidistra with a leathery tap. You and I have daughters of our own. Flora is 15. Despite the evident hardship of her history, despite the lack of, that we have given our own daughters, she is an exceptionally beautiful young person. And what those men will... Josephine interrupted. She brought the back of one hand to her mouth, closed her eyes, and took a long breath. The ticking of the clock, the crackle of the fire, wind-brushed snow spun past the window. Yes, Mr. Fairweather, I can find work for her. The auction will be held after Christmas, he said. He relaxed back into the chair, crossed his legs. At the train station. I am in your service, I am indeed. You lighten my heart with your kindness. No, I have so much. A husband, a family, all of this. She offered him her home on the palm of her hand. It is the least I can do. The smell of baking gingerbread rose from the kitchen. A maid carrying linens came down the stairs, passed through the hall. The ornaments on the Christmas tree turned, borne on invisible currents of sweet-scented air. She stood in the door watching as Mr. Fairweather walked down the drive between shoulder-high snowbanks thrown up by Mr. Dugan's wooden shovel. Cold thinned her nostrils like the crisp edges of Ellen's butter cookies. Lucy, 17, and Maud, 15, would soon be walking home from the Pleasant Valley Academy, the daughters of a sea captain, well fortified against the cold in their long wool coats, mittens, and fur hats. George, attending the University of Mount Allison College, was returning tomorrow on the train. She watched Harlan as he swung firmly down the hill in the direction the Commodore and his dog had been heading, towards home, dinner, family, and she was gripped by her husband's absence. and the dangers he risked. She tried to dismiss fear, although she could not. It remained, dark, dull, tarnishing happiness. In the parlor, she resumed her seat before the fire. She took Simeon's last letter from a pile on a marble tabletop and ran her hand over the paper with as much tenderness as if vellum were skin. She unfolded it, read for the 5th time. My dear Josie, I write from New York, where I am comfortably installed in the Grand Hotel, while Mary Ann is being provisioned. Sailor is curled at my side. Sailor, his beloved St. John's water dog. I have agreed to take 6 women, a mother and 2 daughters traveling with servants, to South Carolina. Mrs. Holdwell's daughter is to be married in Charleston. I told her we would head southwards in the new year, passing Cape Hatteras and keeping as far east as possible from the Outer Banks. I struggle to complete my crew. It is getting harder to find seasoned seamen than in Uncle N's day. The first mate is experienced but in poor health. The second mate is only 19, although willing and honest. I have not yet found a man as capable of navigation as I am myself. It was the fault of his Aunt Azuba and Uncle Nathaniel in Whalen's Cove, she thought. All his boyhood, picking apples in his uncle's orchard or sitting on their veranda high over the Bay of Fundy, he'd imbibed seafaring tales, rounding the Horn, sighting a ship stranded on an iceberg, Antwerp's museums, the volcanic islands off Java. Sea captains' wives are now a rare thing. They are perhaps even pitied. The sea will be my mistress, he'd said, when asking for her hand in marriage. I will not mind, she'd murmured. Mount Allison Wesleyan Academy schooled, modern and brazen, she'd been oddly thrilled by the idea of the sea as seductress. And although their parents did not approve, the wedding was sumptuous, and Simeon had proved them wrong with his success. She slipped the letter back in the envelope and held it to her cheek, watching the fire. The sea as seductress had become a thing she wished he would renounce. He would miss another Christmas. She rose, restless, went into the front hall and lifted a calling card from a silver dish. She studied its scrolled letters, thinking not of the visitor they represented, but of the house rising up around her with its routines. Polished salvers on the sideboard. The order sent to Mr. Cardwell's butcher shop. Mousetraps duly set. And of how she must contrive to cause no ripple, no storm, as if to do so would threaten Simeon's voyage. Josephine heard the harsh jangle of the new telephone. She went to the front hall, lifting the receiver, heard first the operator, then Mr. Fairweather's voice. Despite the weather, the auction will go ahead tomorrow at noon. Stand in the front row where I can see you. She set the receiver in its cradle and stood with her head bowed. She would like to have taken this decision after talking it over with Simeon. He was a man with whom she could discuss things, unlike her father or brothers, or even her own mother, who had not learned to think for herself, nor approved of Josephine's doing so. I am at sea. She said this to him last time he was at home. Without you, I am at sea. They were in bed after making love. He knew how to make her find her pleasure. She lay with her forehead on his shoulder, shy after such intimacy, murmuring into his salty skin. And what does that mean? He said. You should know, she answered. No land beneath one's feet, a wind coming from one way and then another, I suppose, and never sure how to set the sails. And he pulled her to his chest and then rolled over on top of her, slowly letting his weight down until, shrieking, for mercy. "There," he said, "I press you into the ground. No wind will blow you." He made the most of his time at home, brightening the future with plans, acting on impulse. "Where do we build a greenhouse?" Or, "Let's take the children on the train to St. John." When the children were small, he prowled the house on all fours, roaring and snapping at them like a bear. When they were older, he brought them extravagant gifts from Hong Kong or Paris. He swept away her anxieties with his assurances of boundless good fortune. Master of weather, navigation, and command, he exercised the same capabilities as husband, as father. The impulsive side of his nature, announcing one morning with great enthusiasm that he and two friends were going to skate all the way to Fredericton on the St. John River, or on a summer's day, blithely setting forth into the wilderness with a botanist acquaintance on a quest for a purple-fringed orchid, was like a reward, she felt, for his adherences to its opposite. She walked down the hall, calling, "Ellen?" The kitchen was like the cook's own home, with its yellow oilcloth floor, earthenware crocks and copper saucepans, scraps of Irish poetry tacked to the walls like a patina. Ellen, Margaret, Mary, and Mr. Dugan were breaking for tea. Ellen, brisk, stiff-jointed, wearing a cloth cap, poured custard sauce over warm apple cake. "Will you join us for a piece of cake then, Mrs. Galloway?" Her questions were statements, offhand, as if inured from caring, although Josephine knew how her invariable compliments on dessert or roast brought a glint of pleasure quelled by tightened lips. "Thank you, Ellen, but no, I am satiated. That was Mr. Fairweather on the telephone. We're to have a new girl. I'll be bringing her tomorrow. There's been some mistake, and she's being sold at the pauper auction." "Is she from the old country?" "English, 15 years old. Apparently, she was set over as a home child." Looks exchanged. Pickpockets, gutter snipes. Josephine's heart quailed as she saw the response. They assumed, she saw, that the child would be sullen, bitter, ungrateful. Her voice firmed. "Margaret, could you make up a bed for her in the little room at the end of the hall? Make it nicely with plenty of bedding. She was working at that farm where both husband and wife were killed on the mine hill." Ellen paused, the custard spoon briefly forgotten. "Ah, I did read of it. Terrible thing." Her tone yielded aloud the possibility of pity. "Poor wee girl." In the clear morning light, Josephine stood in the hall waiting for Mr. Dugan to come with the horse and sleigh. She held the newspaper in gloved hands and perused the front page. The words were somewhat obscured by her lace shawl, but she did not wish to undo the bow she had tied beneath her chin. "Axe murder. The horrible deed of blood which was committed at Tyne Cove yesterday has caused much excitement. A woman, Mrs. Elsa Kavanagh, was found murdered in the home of Mr. John Tatum, with indications of a violent struggle. Her wrists and hands show marks as if they had been made by the teeth of a human being, and her body bears the marks of bruises. The walls of the room in which she was found are finely spattered with stars of blood. The murder weapon, an axe, was in plain sight, leaning against the stove, soaked in blood. Her reason for being at the home of Mr. Tatum, by his accounts, is as a boarder. She was found by him when he returned from St. John. He saw the body lying on the floor, the head red and her clothes tossed up. By his account, Mrs. Kavanagh, a widow, was of County Tyrone, Ireland, and has been living in this country for over 30 years. She was 50 years of age, portly, of short stature, and ill health. It is not known. The front door opened. She lowered the paper, startled. On the cold air, the smell of horse, the bite of snow. "Ready, ma'am." Mr. Dugan gave her his arm as she stepped up into the sleigh. She had asked him not to tip his hat. "You are in Canada now," she'd said. She settled, pulled up the bearskin rug. A blanket for the girl was folded on the seat beside her. Mr. Dugan handed up a basket prepared by Ellen, gingerbread, a ham sandwich. "She said the girl would be cold and hungry," he explained. Dappled coat groomed to a trout shimmer, the mare snorted, neck arched, as Mr. Dugan climbed into his seat and collected the reins. Josephine, adjusting her collar to cover her nose, felt a wave of pleasure as the sleigh slid down the lane. Lindens, snow-covered lawn, the house Simeon had built for them with its scrolled red trim, turret, and verandas. She leaned forward to enjoy the sight of Hilltop, the town's largest house, built by an English duke for his two childless, widowed sisters. Snow made a conical cap on the roof of its 3-story turret and accentuated its delicious details. Veranda railings topping spindled balusters, Gothic windows with stained glass panes, gingerbread scrollwork. Everything had become like a painting, Josephine thought. All things made less ordinary by a turn in the weather.
Oh, that was beautiful. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it. So I found that to be a real treat. I love listening to it. It's, as I said, it's so poetic. Have you ever written poetry? Because I know you've written so many other things. You've written nonfiction and memoir and fiction, but what about poetry?
I haven't written much poetry. I must say that I used poetry as what I call a touchstone, in that I love to read it. I think it is the most difficult of skills for a writer. Maybe that's a matter of temperament, but it's a very demanding form. And when I read it as a kind of reminder to myself of excellence, my writing, for example, right now I'm writing a memoir, and I feel poetry much more present in the underpinnings of that work. Whereas with a novel, it's there because I love words and I love to play with words and I love the sound and feel of them. But I am more conscious of pacing and dialogue and keeping the piece moving. So I don't write poetry, but I love it and I highly, highly respect it.
Yes, I shy away from it. I don't want to do it the wrong way. You know, there's so much to it. So you've written many novels and memoirs. They're all so different and yet similar. What's it like? Does it feel different when you're writing? And you were talking about the pacing and the rhythm, and how does it feel differently? Because I'm too afraid to write a memoir. Also because I don't think I could remember anything about my life. So I don't think it'd be a very exciting memoir. But does it feel like a whole different process? It must, because you don't have to do as much research, obviously, when you're writing that way.
Yes. I have always been a journal keeper. Since my mother gave me a little tiny diary about this big when I was probably about 8. I still have them. And then I've kept journals my whole life. And it's my way of talking to myself. So I'm very familiar with a kind of introspective writing. It is very different from novel writing. Exactly as you say, you don't have to keep stopping. You don't have to think something like, she struck a match, and then you think, wait a minute, when were matches invented? You know, or that kind of thing. I love creating worlds, and so I love the novel form because I make this world and I don't know what's going to happen, and I wake up every morning thinking with a sense of excitement about, I put my characters here, I wonder what's going to happen to them next. Whereas with memoir, it's more this joy of reliving an epic. And the challenge is to really and truly relive it, and really put yourself there and make it as honest as you can.
Wow. It sounds like something I need to read just to experience it. I read something that you had said, that you trust your subconscious as a powerful resource, which I love the thought process that goes with that. Also that you write with your eyes closed, which really intrigues me. I know that sometimes when I write, I know that I can't watch my fingers, and I know that I can't be, reading directly as I'm working, but sometimes I'll find myself looking out the window and watching whatever's happened. There's a squirrel across the street. And when I look back, my fingers have worked. What does it feel like for you? And do you always write with your eyes closed? How does it work?
There are various levels of engagement in the brain. Often I will think kind of on the top of my brain, okay, this is where this chapter has to take place. Say the chapter I just wrote, it's winter, okay, so it's cold, the light is such and such a way, there's snow, Mr. Fairweather, you put all that stuff in place. But then I have to go there and wait and see what happens. And that's where the good stuff comes. You can't force it. You have to wait. And so I literally, it's almost like this. I just go into this place where I cover my eyes. Usually I start by putting my hands over my eyes. And I just sit there and I wait. And then my fingers start moving, like on the Ouija board, right? My fingers start moving on the keys, and then I'll open my eyes and read what I've written, and it's kind of a back and forth that way. But it's an attempt to make contact with the subconscious.
Mm-hmm. And I like the allusion to the Ouija board as much as you were kidding, because to me, when people started asking me what it feels like to be an author, and when I first started out, I remember listening to authors say, you just have to let the story come and let the character speak to you. And I didn't have a clue what that meant. I just had to try and relax into it. And then as I came to understand it and to love this process more and more, I told some people that it feels almost as if I'm a medium at times, because I'm coming up with stories that I don't know, and yet they feel so definite to me. So to me, it feels, so I'm glad you said the Ouija board, because I have described it as being a medium of sorts. So that was very interesting. So this story, what got you into writing about this and the home children, which is my passion right now, and writing about the home children and the suffragettes and everything that was going on in this book?
One of my teachers told me, I majored in creative writing, and one of my professors told me years and years ago to trust your instinct. And that's a very hard thing to do. It's hard to know what your instinct is and to find it. But for a long time, I've had this lost girl in my head. And she led me, that lost girl. I didn't know why I wanted to write about a lost girl, and it went through many iterations. Many drafts happen. One of those drafts was about a New Brunswick girl who was real, who went to the Civil War disguised as a boy, and I thought, yes, there's my next novel. And then I found out somebody had just written that novel. Then I wrote about my relatives who lived in St. Stephen, New Brunswick, and I was going to write about that time period, which is interesting because it was exactly the time period of this novel that eventually got written. But lo and behold, a stray girl wandered into their house, and then that book didn't happen. And then I felt sort of desperate, and I started writing about time present and some people on a street in the town that became the town of this novel, and a kind of a lost girl. But that lost girl went into the attic and pulled out a newspaper article about the pauper auction. So then a character came out of the pauper auction who was placed in this novel about time present. That novel got scrapped. Another version of that novel got written. That novel got scrapped, but the pauper, the child who in the pauper auction and the lost child stayed. And finally, I realized this novel has to take place entirely in the past, and it has to be about her. What was the question?
Well, I think I pretty much covered it, because I was wondering where you came up with the idea for it. So, yeah.
Oh, and let me back up one tiny little bit. Yeah, there was yes, it was the pauper auction jumped into my head, and I thought that is the most extraordinary story. And it took place in this town where we live in New Brunswick. And here it's like, it's no big deal. Everybody knows about it. You mentioned the pauper auction. Everybody knows the story. And even the person who comes into this novel and who kind of exposed it to the international press, he was real. And there are historians I know who are still annoyed with that guy 150 years later. They say, oh, he didn't need to be so rude to us about that. It wasn't really that bad. But it's very alive as a story here.
I think it's you're opening a lot of doors to our readers here by talking about your process and stuff. I think it's wonderful, because when you talk about this book and how different, how it was supposed to go this way and then it didn't, and then maybe this way and it didn't, and I think maybe there's a misconception that when we start out on the path of writing a book, that's how it goes, and there it is. There's the story laid out right in front. And I am not a plotter. I sort of follow the story and the characters, and I have gone off course so many times and gone down so many unnecessary rabbit holes, but I loved each and every one of them. And even if I'm taking tens of thousands of words out of the book and rewriting in a different direction, I still know that those are valuable journeys that I've taken. So I love hearing it from your perspective as well. You must have done a lot of research on all the different facets of this book. Like I said, the home children and the auction, but also the suffragettes and the women labor force. And there was a lot of very interesting information in there.
I went to the Provincial Archives of New Brunswick and the New Brunswick Museum, where there's just treasure troves of information. And the people at the people who work at those places are such resources. They came up with things for me, like about what was happening in the factories in St. John in the 1880s. And it was a study it was a commissioned study that the government of the time had made. I would never have known that existed. And it had all the details about what working conditions were like. The papers of the actual papers of the suffragists of the time. And then, of course, there were people I would call or write and say, what kind of policing was done in these years? Or what would a hotel room have looked like in these years? Or, all that. I never made it up. I always would try to find out, really, was there a constable? How many constables would there have been? Did the trains run between New Brunswick and what kind of trains were there? What kind of a floor would have been on the train? How did they heat them? Because when I write, as I said, when my hands are over my eyes, I'm there. And if I can't picture that train, I can't be there. So I have to do that research. But I love it, of course, as you must also.
Exactly. Oh, that's beautiful. And I think that if you fake it, readers know it too. And the whole idea is to tell the truth of the story, and entertaining but truthful at the same time. And I love the business that we're in, Beth. I love what we do, and I know that you enjoy it as I do. So it has been such a treat to meet you via Zoom and to listen to you and to hear all about the book. I was very honored to be asked to read it. So now that it is about to come out, I am telling everybody that this is a book you should go out and get and sit back and enjoy and learn a lot from it. And and maybe read a little bit of it out loud, just so you can appreciate the language that Beth used in this, because I really enjoyed it. So thank you very much, Beth. Thank you for coming and chatting with us.
Thank you so much for having me, and hello to all of you out there who are watching, and thank you for listening. And I wish I could say I'd met you all, but in a way I have. So thank you, Genevieve. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.